I'm with Calev Myers, a lawyer in Jerusalem, and we're talking about his new book, Crucial Alliance. Now, Calev, what is the book about?
Yeah, the book tells a story of the crucial alliance between the African American community and Jews and the Jewish state of Israel. It tells the narrative, the story of the African Americans coming out of slavery in the United States, and then the Jews coming out of the Holocaust, and the alliance that was built between them in the civil rights movement years of the United States. Even though Jews were only 2% of the American public, they made up over 50% of the activists in the civil rights movement fighting for black rights, and largely funded the whole movement. So I talk about why and how both African Americans and Jews suffer many of the same challenges and have worked together in the past to overcome them, and why that alliance is crucial for today.
So there's a lot of parallels between the two groups.
A lot of parallels. If you even take the word ghetto, that was a word that was imported by Jews coming out of ghettos in Europe to the United States. Today, when we talk about ghettos in urban centers in the United States, everybody thinks, well, African-American neighborhoods, right? And of course, systemic and systematic racism and terrorism. I equate KKK with the radical Islamic groups that want to kill Jews simply for being Jews, and it's the same kind of it's the same mindset, the same challenges that both communities have faced.
Mm-hmm. And what inspired you to write this book?
What inspired me to write the book was in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected president for the first time. I was actually excited about it from the aspect of what it said regarding racism and race in the United States, which has always been this very controversial issue. And now we have an African-American president, and isn't this wonderful? This is like the American dream, where, somebody from a minority community, which is, I think, 12% of the American public, has now become president. And my eyes were glued to the television as he made his first public appearance after being elected president, which happened to be in an Islamic university in Cairo. And in that speech, he talked about the need to appreciate the Islamic heritage of America. And that statement just shocked me. I mean, I thought to myself, wow, I've always looked at the African-American community through the lenses of our common Judeo-Christian roots and values, and all the slave rituals were about go down Moses, and there was such they would look to the story of the original slaves, the Hebrew people, as a source of hope, and to come all the way around today to saying, well, no, America has an Islamic heritage from an African American seemed very unusual to me. So I thought that prompted me to research the issue a bit, and then to write the book.
And what sort of things did you find out in the book?
Yeah, I found some very interesting things. We were able to go and talk to leaders in the civil rights movement. We have thousands of hours of original interviews. Jewish leaders who, at the time, had been lawyers that were protecting the right to demonstrate, or judges. People work for the State Department. And for them, and rabbis as well, who marched with Dr. Martin Luther King in Selma. We were able to interview the daughter of Rabbi Heschel, who was like this massive figure in American Judaism, who was marching in the front of the demonstrations with Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King at that time. To hear their stories, to hear their motivations, to understand why, and it really had to do with, okay, we're this minority who was coming out of Europe as a persecuted race to the land of freedom, and so shocked to see the way that there's a double standard of justice for African Americans, and that really inspired them to advocate for America to actually demonstrate the values that it was based upon, which is liberty for all and equality for all. So to hear those personal stories, I think, was an amazing discovery for me. And as part of the process, also to learn, what it was that kind of created a break, because there was a breakdown in the alliance after Dr. Martin Luther King passed away. He had been a staunch Zionist, but his predecessors were much less so. And then you had a phenomena of, after integration, you had blacks, American blacks moving north and coming into cities where the Jews a few decades before were the tenants and now they're the landlords. And so in a lot of the ghettos, the Jews now own the apartments that the blacks are moving into. And the blacks started identifying them as part of kind of the oppressive white majority rather than seeing them as a minority with a common struggle. So that was a big discovery for me, which I put out in the book, and also present a way, I think a healthier way of looking at Israel. Today, many African Americans naturally support the Palestinian cause, but many of them tend to move to more radical expressions of pro-Palestinianism to the extent of anti-Israel advocacy, BDS, which is really a call to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel, and really look at Israel as the evil oppressor in the Middle East. When I believe if you purely look at the situation from a human rights and civil rights perspective, Israel, with all of its challenges, is still what's right in the Middle East and not what's wrong in the Middle East. And if you go throughout the West Bank, which I know you have, because you live in Bethlehem, and you ask, most of the Palestinians that I've asked have said that they would prefer to be a citizen in Israel rather than the state of Palestine if it's ever recognized. And so I bring some of that out in the book. I also say, look, if your heart immediately goes to the underdog and to the minority, the Jews in the Middle East aren't the oppressive majority. We're 6.5 million Jews surrounded by 350 million Muslims. And we continue to be in an existential struggle, and many of those Muslim nations wish that we weren't here, wish that we didn't exist. And so I think that if you're naturally identifying with the underdog, Israel is the underdog in the Middle East. That's what I believe, and not the other way around.
Do you think words like apartheid have been hijacked here in the Middle East?
100%. My grandparents, which I dedicated this book to my mother's parents, who marched against. They were arrested in New York City for marching against African apartheid, I believe in the 1970s. 100%. I think that what was apartheid? Apartheid was systematic discrimination based on race, which meant in South Africa, if you were black, you couldn't study in a white school, you couldn't vote for parliament, you certainly couldn't serve in public office. At certain times in certain areas, you couldn't marry. There was no interracial marriage. If you look at Israel, Israel has a 15% minority right now of Muslim Arabs that serve in our parliament, that sit on our Supreme Court, that receive government-funded education in Arabic, learning Islamic education. And so it's definitely not apartheid. Now, there's a legitimate argument of whether or not that sovereignty should be extended to the Palestinians living in the disputed territories, which is a legitimate debate. But I wouldn't call it apartheid because it's not. It's simply not. So, there's no question that term has been hijacked.
Well, we've had Mahmoud Abbas said if he had a Palestinian state, he'd have no Jew living there. No, that's actually the definition of apartheid, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, not only that, there's apartheid today in the Palestinian state regarding Palestinians, because and the Palestinians are treated with apartheid, which I write about in my book, in all the Arab nations around Israel, where they're still living in refugee camps for the last 68 years, without full citizenship, barred from 73 job categories, unable to receive public medical coverage, public education, cannot vote, cannot hold office, cannot own land, cannot inherit land, cannot buy land. This is happening in Lebanon, Syria, Egypt. After 68 years, Palestinians, even though they're Muslim Arabs, who immigrated to Muslim Arab nations after the violence that took place in the late 1940s, they still have no citizenship, and they're counted as refugees for every intent and purpose. That's apartheid. But it's happening in the Palestinian Authority as well. Why are there refugee camps in the Palestinian Authority? Where if you're a non-refugee Palestinian, you receive education and medical coverage and a certain level of social benefits from Mahmoud Abbas. But if you're a Palestinian refugee, which means you're living in a refugee camp, you receive nothing. And the United Nations is supposed to take responsibility for you. That's an apartheid. The only state in the Middle East, if we look at our immediate region, that doesn't have Palestinian refugee camps is Israel. because the Palestinian refugees that came back after 1948 and 1967 received full citizenship and are fully integrated into our society. I mean, we have today we have an Arab Christian on our Supreme Court. We've had in the past an Arab Muslim on our Supreme Court. They're in these major positions of public leadership as compared to the Palestinian refugees in the West Bank. It's night and day. So I say there is an apartheid taking place against Palestinians in the Middle East everywhere except for Israel.
Now, we see the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, and also we're seeing a lot of problems at the moment in America with shootings of black people and Black Lives Matter. Has anything changed?
I think that's a very good question. I think substantially rights have been achieved, and I mean, the fact that we have had African Americans now on the American Supreme Court and in the White House, and of course, a huge percentage in Congress and so on and so forth. So much achievement has been made, but there's still a lot of work because there is still systemic racial profiling. There is a problem in certain areas of the United States with exaggerated violence from the police. And by the way, I'm not taking sides in the Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter. I'm also not making a generalization regarding all policemen in the United States, because I know that many of them and probably most of them are not racist, but there are certain areas still that you have systemic racism like that, and that creates, in my opinion, a legitimate struggle and a legitimate demand for reform. Where people are still, I've spoke, when I was writing this book, I spoke to some African American friends of mine who are pastors of large churches. I have a friend who's a pastor of a church of about 4,000 people in Savannah, Georgia. He said that him and his wife have this little game that if she's tired and she wants to they want to sit down on a bench together in a mall. And there are white people on the bench. He'll go and sit down first, and the people usually get up and leave so his wife can sit down next to him. And they laugh about it, but that type of racism, and it's based on probably phobias and things. It still exists, and it's still very real. And so we can't deny that's the case. Europe is worse today as far as anti-Semitism is concerned than it ever was since the 1940s, since World War II. We're not there, thank God. And I think one of the reasons that we're not there is that there's an awakening of evangelical Christianity throughout Europe. And because Christians are embracing the Bible and have an appreciation of the people of the Bible, I think that stands as a buffer to the extreme type of anti-Semitism we saw in the 1930s and 1940s. But it's worse than it's been since that time, which means that on a weekly basis there are attacks on Jews just for being Jews, violent attacks throughout Europe. Part of that today it's coming less from Nazism or neo-Nazism, which does exist, by the way, especially in Hungary and certain pockets in Europe, but more from radical Islamic adherents that are immigrating now to Europe and really creating a scary situation of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, you mentioned about the KKK and other racist groups. Do you see radical Islam as something very, very dangerous today in society?
Yes, I absolutely. And I would say that they're very similar to KKK. I mean, KKK is based on an ideology of racial supremacy, and that's really what radical Islam says. It's either Dar el-Islam or Dar el-Harb, either the house of Islam or the house of the sword, which means that you submit and become a confessing, submitted believer to Islam, or you face the sword. And that's just very radical. People who read the Quran and understand it through those lenses are a danger to society, a danger to Jewish people, of course, and to Western society as a whole. And there's no question that it's a huge and immediate danger. I think, though, I want to say this. I want to say that doesn't mean that every Muslim is a threat. And this is one of the biggest challenges in Western societies today, is that radical Islam is a terrible danger. Not every Muslim is a radical a Muslim. And so, how do we figure out who's radical and who's not? How do we figure out who is interpreting Islamic text in this militant way, and who just wants to mind their own business and be a good neighbor and work, and live a good life, etc. And those are important questions to ask, because it would be wrong to profile every Muslim and to somehow treat them as a threat, And so this is a major challenge today.
Do you think intolerance is fear, and fear of something different?
Many times intolerance is based on phobias and fears. Yeah, absolutely. And it's always easier to hate the unknown, But when you actually meet and become friends with an African American or a Muslim or a Jew, whoever the other is, a lot of times those fears are diminished, and therefore your hatred or whatever it is, bigotry, etc., goes away with it. Mm-hmm.
Now, you founded the Jerusalem Institute of Justice. What is that?
The Jerusalem Institute of Justice is an organization that's dedicated to making Israel a freer place with more freedom of religion, civil rights for minorities. We've represented hundreds of cases of Christian minorities in Israel over the last 12 years that we've existed. We have a fund that fights human trafficking and prostitution. We're one of the leading organizations that's working right now to illegalize prostitution in Israel through the adoption of the Criminalization of the Client Act, which is something that passed in several Scandinavian countries, in Ireland and France, which means that it becomes a criminal offense to purchase sex services from another human being. It criminalizes the client. And we when this was passed in Sweden, for instance, prostitution in a matter of a couple of years dropped by like 50%. We want to see that happening. So the Jerusalem Institute of Justice is a platform that I built as a lawyer, simply as a way to use the tools in my toolbox, which is legal, political, and media activism, for nonprofit purposes, and really to try to be a voice for those without a voice, and to take care of communities that fall between the cracks, so to speak, in our society. Mm-hmm.
How is Israel doing with human rights and freedom?
I think that compared to who? Yeah, so if we're comparing, I would say, in light of Israel's massive and unique security problems, it's actually doing a good job. I think that there's always room for improvement. One of the issues that we have is a very strong political power to ultra-religious sectors in our society, and which when they and then come into critical government positions, they make life more difficult for other religious minorities and for people who are not only Jewish but ultra-religious Jewish, and so there are definitely issues of reform in those areas. Marriage is a big issue in Israel. Still in it, we have very archaic marriage laws. There is no way in Israel that a Jew can marry a non-Jew. So Jews can marry Jews, Christians can marry Christians, Muslims can marry Muslims. Who is a Jew for the purpose of marriage is still dictated by the very orthodox streams in those religions. So if you understand anything about Judaism and understand that Judaism comes through maternal heritage, in Israel, somebody who has a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother cannot marry a Jew. So for this reason, 11,000 Israeli citizens fly to Cyprus every year to get married. It's a great industry for the Cyprus tourism industry, but it's really a shame in Israel. And I think that we should eventually have two parallel systems, a religious track for marriage and a civil track for marriage, and couples should be able to choose which way to go. So you don't have all these people who just can't get married in the state where they were born, served in the army, paid taxes and everything else. So we have these kind of issues that usually have to do with religion and state, and that need a lot of work. I would say regarding our Israeli Arab minorities, we could do much better with resource allocation compared to, for instance, rezoning and licenses for building new Arab neighborhoods. Very, very small compared to their numbers within the Israeli society. When we look at the amount of resources that have been dedicated to expanding Jewish living settlements. So when you go into the Arab neighborhoods, if you drive to Nazareth or drive, to other areas you'll find them much more densely populated because there just aren't enough building licenses. So I think more land needs to be allocated for Arab development. That's a huge area that we could improve in. Funding for religious and educational institutions. Although they're 15% of our society, they're not getting 15% of the funding. It's more down around like 1 or 2%. By the way, in this Knesset, now that there's the United Arab List, which I think they became the third largest party in the Knesset, they have more political clout than they've ever had, our Arab citizens, and are for the first time in the history of Israel really at the table on these funding discussions, and which is helping to improve the situation. But there's definitely areas that we need to improve in.
So what's your prayer for the book, finally?
My prayer for the book? That I sell 1 million copies. I mean, I want to... Today, and this if you read through the book to the end, I really believe that the disconnect from the kind of Judeo-Christian roots of the African-American community is one source of distress for them. If you look at what's happening in the inner cities right now, all of my African-American friends would say that there are two things that are majorly lacking. Number one, fatherhood. So I forget the numbers, but 70, 80% in some cities of single mother households in the African-American community, so fatherhood. Number two, entrepreneurism. Many of these families are living on welfare. Fatherhood and entrepreneurism are two hugely like Hebrew Jewish values, where we're around the table every Shabbat blessing our children, blessing our wives, teaching our children to take responsibility, to be entrepreneurs, in business and education, all these areas. And so those are just two examples of Hebrew values that are missing in the African American community by and large. And so this understanding or revival of an understanding of the importance of this crucial alliance, I think is kind of a roadmap out of the distress that the urban communities are in right now in the United States. But it will also be good for Israel because the minority voice in America is stronger than it's ever been. George W. Bush, when he was an unpopular president at the end of his first term, going in the elections before his second term, he received 60% of the white vote, and he won. Mitt Romney in the last elections, when he ran against Barack Obama, received 60% of the white vote and lost because of the voice of the minority communities in the United States is growing. I'm very concerned if they really jump on the BDS bandwagon and become anti-Israeli, what that would mean for us in the future. And so I think that my prayer is that people in the Jewish community, in the African-American community, and people who care about justice in general will read the book, be inspired, and help rebuild this bridge. Mm-hmm.
And where can people get a copy of the book?
The easiest place to get a copy of the book is on Amazon. So if you just go on Amazon and look for Crucial Alliance by Calev Myers, you can either download it in Kindle or order a paperback copy. Yeah.
Okay, Calev, thank you very much.
Thank you.